All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the final panel of today of Urban Arc 2021, Urban Imaginaries. Thanks for sticking around, and we're very excited to have a very interesting set of papers on a very exciting panel. So what I'll do is quickly just introduce our panelists for today. We have Annika Taneja, who's an independent researcher. Rahul Mukherjee from the University of Pennsylvania, Debasish Mishra from the National Institute of Science, Education and Research, the Department School of Humanities and Social Sciences. We have Isha Tyagi as well from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, and hopefully we'll be joined soon with Manatullah Hindawi, who's from TU Berlin, as well as the Orient Institute at Beirut. Like I said, this is a panel that sort of looks at media interventions, intersecting with urban and urban imaginaries. Without taking too much of your time, I'd like to introduce our first speaker for the day. That's Annika Taneja. Thanks, Annika, for being here, and over to you.
Thanks, Vikas. I'm just going to share my screen. I hope that's visible.
Yes, it is.
Okay, perfect. So good evening, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Annika, and I'm an independent researcher, and my work focuses on contemporary Indian science fiction, which is what I'm going to be speaking to you about today. A quick disclaimer before I dive in. I'm going to be using the terms science fiction and speculative fiction interchangeably, and that is contentious depending on what side of the debate you're on. So if you're someone who is not happy with that, I apologize in advance. In the interest of time, I cannot give a detailed defense of my decision. To dive right in, now, even for those of us who don't study the urban, it's evident that the future is always imagined to lie in cities. There is a general belief that history and progress are linear things, and to be more urban is to be more developed, is to be more prosperous, and thus is a desirable state. That's why it comes as no surprise that almost all works of science fiction, if not all works of science fiction, feature a city in some shape or form, either in the background or sometimes even in the foreground as one of the main characters. In fact, it's difficult to hear the phrase urban imaginaries and not think of science fiction, right? Because as far back as 1516, you had Sir Thomas More writing his influential work, Utopia, and trying to imagine what the perfect place would be like. And for him as well, the perfect place was a city. Now, there have obviously been people who have been critical of this idea that the future lies in urban areas. And one of the notable critics of such an idea was Mahatma Gandhi himself. But for most science fiction writers and readers, and even for the layman, there is a sense that the future lies in a city in some shape or form. Now, this sense of social dreaming that locates itself in the urban is what Lyman Dower Sargent calls utopianism, just a form of social dreaming of a better place, even if you can't give it a concrete material reality or a spatial form. And in India, this was no different. In the post-colonial context, it became absolutely urgent to have these spaces of the future. And this is what Gyan Prakash termed the urban turn in Indian nationalist thought. So you think of spaces like Chandigarh, or you think of the steel cities like Bokaro, Jamshedpur, Durgapur in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And today, obviously, you would think of the smart city. These are all things that fall well within the tradition of utopian urban imaginaries. But even before we gained independence, and even before nation building became a project, you had people who were dreaming of these sort of perfect urban spaces. So in 1905, you had a Begum Rokeya sitting in what is now West Bengal, writing her novella Sultana's Dream, which is about a feminist utopia where women run the world and men stay in the zenana. And if you go even further back to the 15th century, you have someone like the poet Ravi Das dreaming of a city called Begumpura, which is a socialist utopia where there is no caste and there is no class, and everyone lives roughly in an equal state of being. And to speak of today, you have social movements like Shaheen Bagh, or you have a phrase like Achhe Din. And these are all instances of utopianism, because even if they don't have a concrete form, they are aspiring towards a future that is better than the present. Certain parts of India, of course, have a very rich heritage of science fiction. So you're thinking Bengali literature, Marathi literature, and so forth. But in about the last 30 years, we've also seen a sort of boom in Indian speculative writing in English. Maybe since about 1997, when the author Manjula Padmanabhan won the Onassis Prize for her speculative play titled Harvest. Post that, we've seen a lot of texts coming out that are sort of in the genre of speculative fiction or science fiction, and that body of work is the focus of my presentation. But of course, the question that arises is, why should we focus on these texts, and how do they relate to studies of the urban? In a paper titled Beyond Techno-Utopia and Its Discontents, on the role of utopianism in speculative fiction in shaping alternatives to the smart city, three researchers, Olivia Bina, Andy Inch, and Lavinia Pereira, make the argument that while social sciences predict the places that we would live in, speculative fiction as a source goes beyond simply spatial imaginaries and gives us a sense of the kind of lives we would have in these future cities. In other words, it offers us a glimpse into future lived experience. And I believe this speaks directly to the problem that Nick Dunn highlights when he compares contemporary urban imaginaries to a palimpsest, or to a sort of vision of the future that is born in the past. And Dunn's point, of course, is that this may be subconscious, but what ends up happening is because our urban imaginaries are born in a certain socio-cultural context, they end up circumscribing the same limits of these contexts to recreate futures that roughly look like the present or the past that we've already had. Science fiction, on the other hand, has always been a radical genre where imagination is concerned, right? It has always pushed limits and crossed boundaries and crossed frontiers. So in the hands of the right people, thus, science fiction literally becomes a tool for something radically different, a radically different kind of society and a radically different kind of city. But how would this then sort of influence someone who is reading a work of science fiction? How does it make them engage with the urban? At this point, it's worth diving into a little bit of foundational science fiction theory through the work of a prominent science fiction theorist called Darko Seuwen, who said that science fiction, because it is a genre that is fundamentally alien, right? Typically, science fiction narratives take place in a world that is alien to us, and we have to put a little extra effort to understand how these worlds function. We are introduced to even the simplest thing like transport or chains of production because we don't know anything about these worlds. And as a result, we're paying a lot more attention than we normally would to a realist work of fiction. So Seuwen argued that as a reader is uncovering the systems, the tensions, the contradictions of a fictional world, they might come to discover certain critical strategies or ways of thinking that apply to their own reality as well. And when this connection comes full circle, it forms what he calls a feedback loop. So the reader starts to see her context through the lens of the text and recognize its shortcomings or its unfulfilled aspirations. So it's not the work of fiction itself, but the form in which it's read, the act of reading it, that has transformative potential. To illustrate this point, I'm going to briefly discuss the themes of two Indian works of speculative fiction. One is Leela, which is a novel by Prayag Akbar, and the second is All Quiet in Bikaspuri, which is a graphic novel by an author called Sarnath Banerjee. Now, each of these texts is about a future Delhi, and each of these is a dystopian text that features neighborhood and neighborhood violence in a Delhi in which inter-community ties have broken down and community resources have dwindled. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack in these texts, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to look at two major themes. In his work on the rise of homeowner associations in the USA, Ivan McKenzie coined the term privatopia in 1980 to describe these planned communities that are mostly populated by affluent, privileged individuals and families, and the ones that embody the pursuit of utopian aspirations by privatizing public life. In other words, think of the countless gated communities, residential colonies, and real estate projects that have come up in India that are almost self-contained environments. They have gyms, they have shops, and there's no need to step out, right? And it's deeply reminiscent, thus, this phrase of the social spatial logic of our Indian cities, which are actually not as innocuous and impartial as we'd like to believe. They do have certain logics that dictate how these spaces are organized. If you look on the right, I've attached an advertisement. This is a real advertisement for a real estate project that is 13 kilometers outside of Bangalore and advertises itself as an exclusive Brahmin community township. Now, in his work, Prayag Akbar takes this tendency and shows us a Delhi which is now crisscrossed by 59 feet walls that divide it into different sectors that are occupied by people of the same caste or the same religion. And intersector movement is little to none. What the text does is it takes a social and a cultural tendency and turns it into a very material reality, magnifying the inequalities and the unspoken biases and contracts of our cities to a grotesque, almost intolerable degree. And what happens is that literally caste boundaries, they become boundary walls, upper and lower class becomes upper city and lower city, and so forth. You can see in the screenshot that I've attached from the Netflix adaptation of the novel, the idea that there is an Ashraf sector, and so forth. Now, throughout the text, Akbar constantly refers back to the Delhi of the past to sort of highlight the faux cosmopolitanism that leads to this deeply divided future. And in both Leela and Vikasapuri, there is the theme of the privilege building and retreating into these oases of immunity, of indifference, not unlike what happens in our cities today, and the very concept of the commons disappearing. Now, this sort of physical layout that is extremely divided by sort of a social identity is very reminiscent of, in fact, the typical layout of an Indian village, right? I've attached a layout map of a village in the district of Farrukhabad, and as you can see, it is very clearly divided by caste. Now, the fight for control over community resources, like water and land, has always been at the heart of rural caste conflict, and that prompted the thinker Aditya Nigam to deem the traditional layout of the Indian village as a form of personal dystopia for Dalits. On the other hand, however, you've had this sort of myth that's been created of Indian cities as a space that's completely free of caste, as a space where class operates and merit operates, and perhaps to some degree religion. But caste is as such not so much of a factor. Though it's harder to pinpoint visually upon entering a city, caste, of course, is not absent from the city, right? There have been multiple studies of the sort of spatial organization of Bangalore, Pune, Calcutta that reveal that there is a caste logic. In All Quiet in Vikaspuri, Sarnath Banerjee dispels and challenges this idea through the character of Rastogi. He has, on the one hand, a lot of upper caste businessmen and government official characters who hog resources like water and peddle the idea of trickle-down economics as a cure for inequality. On the other hand, you have the character of Rastogi, who is discriminated against his entire life for the way he smells, but his odor is a direct result of his lack of access to water. In Vikaspuri, the novel, these invisible fault lines become very real when the water supply of Delhi dries up altogether and levels the playing field. Everyone loses access to water. And in the absence of this valuable resource, what happens is the community starts aligning in the form of almost militarized interest groups. And Banerjee satirizes this through fake posters, where he takes popular war movies and makes parodies of their titles to depict the I guess you could say interlocal or intercommunity water wars that are happening in Delhi. So, for example, you have Khurana's List, which is a play on Schindler's List, and on the image of the right, you have a direct reference to the area of Shalimar Bagh. And that is sort of what the point that I'm trying to make about feedback loops. But I'm arguing that these texts of speculation are valuable as urban resources because they enter the privatopia of the urban liberal reader, and they're largely also written by a similar community. And they do this entry into their privatopias in a way that perhaps urban studies and maybe even social science critique cannot or does not. And by doing so, they challenge the notion for the reader that the reader's life is untouched by caste if they personally are not discriminating on the basis of it, right? Instead, they offer a powerful reminder that caste continues to exist in a host of different guises in 21st century cities. It can be a gated residence, it can be a cultural affinity, it can be as simple as hygiene standards, to name a few. And caste therefore continues to determine not just the present, but also the future. That's why instead of a conclusion, which anyway, literary studies, it's very hard to sort of give hard conclusions, I believe it's more important to end with a question, which is who gets to write the future? It's about the authorship and the ownership of the future, right? Who has a right to imagine the future? Who has a right to shape the city? Typically, it's urban practitioners, it's architects, or planners, government officials, sarkari officials. In fact, millions of people in our city don't even get to shape their present. That's why it becomes important to pay attention to these acts of speculation and shaping when they do take place. And it can be as small as someone trying to predict the level of traffic in the evening, or as big as someone writing a text about what India would be like in 2050. And why these works like a Sultana's Dream or a Begumpura become important is because they push for us to occupy a better place than the one we're at, right? They're pushing us to build a world that's more equitable, that is more sustainable, and so forth. And I'd like to argue that as urban researchers, we can only benefit from tuning into these narratives as well, whether they're textual or otherwise, because they not only reimagine what the urban can be, they not only engage with what the urban can be, but they also push us to re-examine our sort of visions for the urban as urban practitioners, as urban researchers, to go beyond the limit and to dream of bigger and better futures for our cities. I'd like to leave you with three of my favorite images from an exhibition of speculative art that took place in Delhi in 2019, where different artists were asked to revise certain aspects of Indian history and see where they think that would have led us. So, for example, Sumaya here has done an illustration of what she thinks India might have been like if it had never come in contact with Victorian morality and gender and sexuality in India had been allowed to be free and fluid. You have the artist Praxic reimagining what the preamble of India would have looked like if it had been a union like the European Union. And you have Kunal Gore imagining what Indian advertising would have looked like if Goldspot had somehow contracted Kendall Jenner. Yeah, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Annika. That was really interesting. Just to folks who are tuning in now, what the way we are running this panel is we'll have the speakers speak for about 12 to 15 minutes, and we have open question time of about 5 minutes following each of the presentations. So please type in your questions in the chat box or the Q&A box on your screen, and we'll take questions for Annika now. While hopefully the questions come in, Annika, what I thought might be interesting to talk a little bit about is the idea of the fantastic in speculative fiction. And I just want to sort of connect it to sort of your foundational theoretical frame of looking at the feedback loop. And I was wondering if, I mean, in the work that you've read from Leila and all quite in the Kasperi, is that is there do you sense distance because of the fantastic nature? Is there skepticism and denial of those? Does that affect the loop?
So one of the things that actually the same theorist argues is that it's actually useful to have a sort of distance between what's happening and what's actually in the reality around you. And he calls this cognitive estrangement. And he says science fiction is powerful precisely because it presents fiction as fact. And it forces you to consider what it's presenting as fiction as in fact a reality, right? And that's how it's different from fantasy. When something in fantasy happens, it is explicitly magical, right? Typically, fantasy novels, you have the descriptions that make anything magical that's happening out to be extraordinary. Science fiction does the opposite. It doesn't even acknowledge that something is fantastical or extraordinary. And Darko Sivan argues that because it does that, it actually forces you to take it seriously. It forces you to sort of suspend your disbelief and invest in it. And if you don't, you tend to miss certain things, right? These are very detailed instances of world building. So his argument is that actually having that distance is beneficial to science fiction because it requires you to imagine yourself in that space and to learn about that space as if you're walking into a place for the first time. And that sort of fresh perspective is what you can take back to your reality. And you might start to notice certain systems that you didn't notice until you encountered them in the text.
Thanks. Okay, I mean, we haven't got any questions yet, so maybe I'll just squeeze in one more over here, if you don't mind.
Yeah. No, of course.
I was just thinking, like the other one I was sort of thinking about is the idea of caste and castelessness, and sort of thinking about speculative fiction in some senses, particularly Leila, as situated in class. More like there's a very strong marker of that, and do you see within those a sort of intersectionality of markers? I mean, does language
Of course.
feature? If you could
So
speak
they do sort of feature language, perhaps not as prominently, because again, it's a novel that's in English, and sort of just by virtue of that, it is sort of forced to sort of level out maybe language diversity. But of course, there is an interplay, however, of caste and class that I think the author is arguing for. And specifically with respect to his work, he actually, about 2 years before he released Leila, he wrote a long form essay that was titled How Indians Trick Themselves into Believing Caste is Absent from Their Cities. And in that, he sort of details out his sort of, and this is again very personal to him, his vision of how he believes that caste and class have an interplay. And there is, of course, there is intersectionality in lived experience, right? That you often, like if you are a woman, you might be coming up against patriarchy. If you're a Dalit woman, you're facing a whole different kind of patriarchy, right? But again, they're always working together. You can't have caste and not have class, unfortunately, because caste is so materially rooted, right? It's rooted in your access to resources, it's rooted in your profession, so to speak. So of course, that's all there. I think different texts might recognize this to a different degree. Some texts might choose to go with an analogy that only focuses on class difference. But what is interesting about Indian speculative fiction is, again, that it is acknowledging the certain specific kinds of dystopia that we would face here, as opposed to anywhere else in the world.
Thank you for that. We have a question that's come in from Elsa Matthews. How do you view a film like PK in its attempt to imagine a city? I'm guessing it's the Amir Khan starrer PK.
Yeah. So yes, there are obviously, like, again, PK sort of falls into the tradition of science fiction in the sense that he is an alien. And it sort of does the same thing if you think about it. Because what's happening is that PK is coming into this sort of environment as an outsider. And again, he's doing sort of same thing that a reader would be expected to do. So he's sort of functioning as the reader, and the world that he's getting dropped into is functioning as the text, right? So he comes into this alien world that for him is alien, and he does certain maneuvers and he has certain interpretations of it that make the people around him re-question it and make the viewer re-question it. So if you think about it, it's sort of a very typical science fiction trope. What is just different is that instead of the alien being something that we view as an object, the alien is the subject. It's the alien's subjectivity that is becoming a lens for the world. But yeah, in terms of its construction of the city, I would argue that it is a science fiction trope, a very typical science fiction trope that just sort of switches it around. It's been a long time since I've seen the movie, so I'm sorry if this is not a very detailed answer. I've only seen it once.
No, I think that was great. Thank you so much. What we'll do now is, just in the interest of time, keep going. But please do keep, for the folks tuning in, please do keep the questions coming in. We'll take stock of time at the end of the panel and then come back to some of those questions, particularly for speakers who've already gone ahead. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Rahul, who's speaking to us from the University of Pennsylvania today.
Thanks, Vikas. I'll just share the screen and then. I'm guessing it's visible.
Yes, please.
Thanks. So I'm going to be talking a bit about mediation of infrastructures, in my particular case, mediation of cell antennas, and how they shape both infrastructural imaginaries and urban futures. And of course, it's related to media imaginaries as well. So since 2010, Indian news media have been reporting on cases of health concerns among urban residents living close to mobile towers. In January of that year, Mumbai's afternoon daily newspaper Midday reported cancer cases in the Usha Kiran building located in the plush Carmichael Road area of South Mumbai. Residents of a number of buildings in that neighborhood appealed to the owners of Vijay Apartments, one of the residential communities in their locality, to remove the cell tower on top of their building. The tower was considered to be the source of cancer cases in the Usha Kiran building, which faced Vijay apartments. This was, of course, challenged, and hence the controversy. Later on, this image was converted into a diagram explaining the ways in which cell antenna beams in the direction of these beams could have affected neighboring communities at particular floors of the building, and found its way to PowerPoint presentations by experts and counter experts. As the controversy unfolded, living in the presence of mobile tower radiations was compared to being inside a microwave oven or a furnace. The heating effects that the cell antenna signals produced through the radio frequency, non-ionizing electromagnetic fields, that is RF EMFs, they were compared to the heating effects produced by furnace. And Rajasthan Patrika and its local Jaipur edition sort of launched a campaign, Bhatti Mein Sheher, city inside the furnace. It's notable that initially most of the media coverage was in local newspapers or local editions of newspapers like Midday and Rajasthan Patrika, because the cell tower radiation issue was much hyper local. It was about two neighborhoods or two buildings next to each other. That was kind of the initial controversy. The influence of infrastructure suggests that infrastructures work in the background, providing the foundation or substructure for several everyday operations. And yet we often witness spectacular displays of certain infrastructures. Almost paraphrasing Brian Larkin here, the breakdown theory of infrastructures notes that people notice infrastructures when infrastructures break down or turn disruptive. And I've been arguing that that's kind of what happened with cell antennas. Certainly they turn disruptive. The mobile tower has eventful properties. It houses antennas which have the ability to emit radio waves in particular directions, the power density of which cannot always be reliably measured, and the biological effects of exposure to such electromagnetic radiations remain uncertain. This makes them part of events and issues which cannot be easily anticipated nor resolved. The intense focus on the mobile tower, to put in science studies scholar Noor Maris's formulation, the front staging of the infrastructure of mobile towers, led to mediation of the relations between different stakeholders: cellular operators, tower builders, municipal corporations, building owners, oncologists, affected community members. So they all formed what I've often called as environmental publics. Even scientists and other experts remain divided and uncertain about the long-term health effects of cell antenna signals. There's a particular culture of uncertainty remains about this media infrastructure and the urban imaginaries it constitutes and is in turn constituted by. And I've written more about cultures of uncertainty in the book Radiant Infrastructures, but I'll not go there for now. A talk show like We the People assembled a whole cast of social actors, from powerful experts to invited citizens related to the cell tower radiation debate, into one studio at the same time. Barkhadat, as the show's moderator, mediated between so-called lay perspectives and expert commentaries, and questions emerged like, what is the appropriate distance from the cell towers? What is the distance the tower should be from your house to be safe? Some of that's invited guests provide testimonies from inside a television studio. A different example, in the lifestyle show Living It Up, CNN, IBN, CNN, News 18, some of the same guests appear, but this time they offer a situated testimony from the place where they first recognized the possible or potential deleterious effects of proximate cell towers. Using the testifier's embodied presence in a mobile tower's field of influence, it's putting it this way because the strength of an antenna's signal is inversely proportional to the square of the distance from it. The lifestyle show wants to emplace audiences in that location. It does matter how this kind of anecdotal evidence is presented differently in these two different shows. So in a way, I'm arguing that the difference in the format of these shows does matter. The difference in the mediation matters in the way anecdotal evidence is presented. By mid-2012, India's telecom regulatory authorities, TRAI and others, had passed stricter policies restricting antenna emission levels and ordered evictions of cell antennas that flouted city construction rules. The implementation of those guidelines remains debatable. In early 2014, cellular operators were citing the removal of cell towers by the government and anti-radiation activists as the reason behind the recurrent call drops experienced by India's mobile service customers. with the entry of Reliance Jio in 2015, there was certainly a spurt in infrastructural investments in both, not just spectrum and optical fibers, but many other areas, as other telecom players like Airtel were also constructing cell towers or were renting more of them on a massive scale in order to provide affordable digital data packages to the rising number of smartphone users. So I follow these set of micro and macro media events and public gatherings around cell antennas to theorize infrastructural imaginaries. The philosopher Charles Taylor has noted that imaginaries in their orientation toward the future are almost always drawn from historical experiences, geographic predicaments, and presently existing fields of social practice. My reason for studying imaginaries and media together is because imaginaries stress shared understandings, and media helps to reconfigure them. Imaginaries lie between the work of culture and the tasks of policy, and they thread together development priorities with lived realities. In their conceptualization of socio-technical imaginaries, Sheila Jassenhoff and others have advised scholars to consider such imaginaries to be not part of an individual scientist's or engineer's mind, but as, quote, promises, visions, and expectations of future possibilities that are embedded in the social organization and practices of science and technology, unquote. If there is a call drop or an app is failing to download, users start locating sometimes frantically, a cell tower in their vicinity. If somebody day in and day out is looking outside their balcony to find a cluster of cell antennas, they might worry about their proximity with the emitted signals. Thus, there is a phenomenological dimension to infrastructures which Lisa Parks has explored through the concept of infrastructural imaginaries. Parks explains infrastructural imaginaries to be, quote, different ways of thinking about what infrastructures are, where they're located, who controls them, and what they do. Her interest in infrastructural imaginary stems from how ordinary people in their everyday encounters approach infrastructures as, quote, objects of curiosity, power, investigation, and concern, unquote. At one level, ordinary citizens experience inequitable infrastructural access to cell phone services or unwanted intimacies with cell tower radiation in their everyday lives, which is part of their infrastructural imaginaries. At another level, the representational logics of infrastructures and statecraft get linked. That is, infrastructural progress gets to stand in for national progress. So infrastructural imaginaries are co-produced by states and citizens and lie at the intersection of structured state policy, corporate initiatives, and lived experiences, that is, affective encounters of ordinary citizens. And it just sort of suggests just how ordinary and quotidian they could be in terms of these affective encounters. This is a cluster of cell antennas atop a three-floor hotel building, which is surrounded by a bunch of high-rise apartments in a posh sort of Cuff Parade Road area. And I visited them. I took this picture at one point of time. Because of regulations, most of them had been dismantled. But then when I visited a resident, he shared this clip that he was having tea at his balcony. And then he saw that the towers were again being put up, and he himself took this video as well. So this is how quotidian things are in terms of these affective encounters. And one has to think about that everydayness of infrastructures as one is thinking about infrastructural imaginaries and urban futures. While I was studying the cell antenna radiation issue in the early decade of 2010s, the role of resident welfare associations was growing, and the elite urbanites as urban citizens were claiming a particular idea of the city for themselves. Cell antennas might be aesthetic eyesores for some, but others consider them a part of Indian modernity that guarantees they can use their sleek mobile phones. Thus, they remain ambivalent structures in the urban planning scripts, at once comparable to polluters and yet part of urban development projects in the green category inhabited by shopping malls and multiplexes. While the environmentalism of the anti-cell antenna campaign was to some extent tinged by not in my backyardism, that is NIMBYism, and bourgeois environmentalism, it needs to be noted that some of the arguments made by elite urbanites about flouting of regulations by cell tower companies was indeed accurate. So just one example from Manhattan. So I often stop to take pictures of camouflage cell antennas that tend to blend with the built landscape. This image of a cell antenna in the New York City at the intersection of East 8th Street and 5th Avenue with its brick-like fascia is one example of the different ways cell antennas are concealed or made inconspicuous. Cell antennas are at times considered eyesores, and at other times their proximity to residential buildings create anxiety among those who live close to them. Hence the cell tower equipment manufacturers desire to disguise them, sometimes like this, sometimes as antenna trees. Not just in media studies, but also in science and technology studies and anthropology, the question of the visibility and invisibility of infrastructures has been a crucial way of theorizing infrastructures. While cell antennas are more visible and even conspicuous than other media infrastructures like optical fiber cables and data centers, the invisibility of cell antennas has to do with the invisibility of cell antenna signals. Cell antennas are not spatially restricted to their tangible materialities. They in fact cast a wider net through the effects of their imperceptible emissions that scatter and spread. Wireless signals move through the air as medium. While conceptualizing the infraness of radiant infrastructures, scholars simply cannot confine themselves to studying the visibility and or invisibility of cell towers. They must account for the invisible radiations. To think about infrastructural imaginaries and urban futures related to Indian cities, scholars will have to consider these radiation sensing practices activated by concerned citizens that rearranged intermediate relations between across signal detectors, microwave ovens, aluminum foils, cell antennas, human bodies, and mobile phones. So this one is a kind of example of a meeting put together by resident associations where concerned citizens use microwave ovens, radiation detectors, aluminum foils to make radiation visible and palpable. And there were also presentations by tower builders about sort of explaining what's happening with cell tower radiation. Um, uh, Regulation monitoring was also sort of provided. Tarang Sanchar was launched by TERM and TRAI, among other regulatory authorities, about providing measurements. But both the measurements by the regulatory authorities as well as by concerned citizens were debatable and were questioned, partly also because of the difficulty in measuring and in terms of consistently measuring signals, which are quite dynamic at different points and keep changing. The debates around siting of cell phone antennas suggest an irony in the sense that it is their fixed net obduracy which creates issues even as they support network coverage and finally mobility of urbanites as they remain connected online, even as they move. Jeffrey and Doron have sort of presented this analogy of cell towers are to cell phones as gas stations are to cars. To still continue on the point of infrastructural visibility and invisibility, Jeffrey Bowker and Lee Starr note that exaggerated displays of the monumentality of infrastructures is one kind of infrastructural visibility. Another kind of infrastructural visibility would further public understanding of what makes infrastructures work on a day-to-day basis. And this is where perhaps there's a need for infrastructural disposition to make connections across different parts and components of cell towers. So a place where the security guard sometimes stays, or the generator handler stays, so on and so forth. So all this are a part of sort of cultivating a kind of infrastructural disposition towards cell antennas. Delivering wireless services and maintaining public health are both crucial, and therefore it is not surprising that wireless service providers and affected communities often end up battling one another over the introduction of 5G, fifth generation wireless technologies, which are all the rage now. Cellular service providers tout 5G as the next generation tech that will cut latency periods, provide seamless streaming as never before, and make augmented reality and the Internet of Things more fun and part of the everyday smart lives. Some suggest caution, noting that 5G could spark global trade and security disputes, and public health scholars remain skeptical about whether the radio frequencies emitted by 5G antennas are indeed safe. As India looks forward to implementing 5G introduction and expansion, urban futures remain uncertain. Just briefly mentioning about Shankar's 2.0 film, because I haven't talked about fictional stuff, and this might be where there's some correlation with Annika's presentation as well. So Shankar's 2.0 contains the post-human humanimal machine figuration of Pakshi Rajan, a swarm of cell phones flying in formation like a flock of birds gathering together. 2.0 suggests that to make sense of high-tech peril like the cell phone or the cell antenna radiation, scientific explanations will not be enough. and that such anxieties about uncanny spectral and ethereal radiations will have to be poured into a wider sea of mythical time and affects. Technoscience provides some answers in 2.0, but when technoscience lacks rational answers for the imaginative leaps made in the film's narrative and action sequences, audiences are asked to supplement such a lack with references to a mythic past where post-human hybrids existed. So Pakshirajan's figure sort of, I think you have Jatayu or Garuda for that matter. The regulatory body, that is TRAI and others, have made an infrastructural analogy at one point that every terrace, just like every terrace has an overhead tank for water supply, such terraces should also have a cell antenna for information connection. Stopping the growth of telecom infrastructure in the name of environmental ramifications would perpetuate the digital divide and inequities they have reasoned. These are not just practical considerations of infrastructures, they also build an infrastructural imagination based on aspirations of technological modernity that encompasses the whole nation. The cell towers in urban India were caught up in messy entanglements with regulatory bodies, housing societies, and radiation debates. These antennas were both private and public technologies that were privately owned and were a source of rent for apartments hosting them, but their signals moved through public places and served the mobile phones of a variety of customers making their way through the street next to the apartment. Given the nature of hyperlocal disputes around cell antennas, I've closely attended to the connections between spatial practices and urban socialities and the role of media infrastructures as agents of change alongside people and institutions. Thank you.
Thanks, Rahul. Thanks so much for that. So I think let me just see what's on the questions over here. I have a question here from Manas who's saying, curious whether there are any similar accounts from around the time of Dish TV, like Sky, etc., when there was a rampage on installing dish antennas. So, I mean, in terms of discourses around Dish TV, around Sky, around international television, particularly coming into India post neoliberalization.
I haven't found that many cases, but antenna sighting in general, both for TV and cell phones, there have been disputes, and not just in India, but also certainly in the UK with TV antennas. I mean, there have been concerns about television signals in general, even the ones beamed from the TV into a person's homes. And at that point of time, even in early sort of 1930s and 1940s as well. So yeah, I mean, in one way to think about it is that it's a new technology which would require some time to work out. What is perhaps interesting in the case of cell antennas is how things have shifted in terms of the discourse from, a 2G, 3G, 4G to now 5G. So, and 5G seems to be having not just microwave, but also being used in millimeter wave technologies, so smaller wavelengths and higher frequencies. And that's been a concern raised by some public health scholars.
I'll read out one more question over here, and I think Annika as well has a question. So, Rahul, for you, with Smart City project, telecommunication infrastructure is expected to expand in various urban tiers. Do you believe the impact of microwaves need to be studied pan-India before policy implementation?
Well, I think so. This is where I think the difference with 5G is happening. So there are, in some cases, so microwave has been studied, say in the case of 3G, 2G, and 3G to some extent. And with 5G, there seems like there will be some which will be based on microwaves, which will continue to be based on microwaves. But there's also this chance that some of it will be based on millimeter waves. And it's mostly around millimeter waves where the discussion has been more sort of controversial, saying that, this is the newer technology. These are like smaller antennas, but they'll be more widespread. So some are more fine with that kind of ubiquity, like that they'll be everywhere and all pervasive at the same, and they'll be smaller, so they'll be maybe more inconspicuous. at the other end, some others are more worried that because they'll be more numerous than before, that might cause a panic. So yeah, I mean, that's where the debate is right now. Yeah.
Annika, go ahead. You had a question?
Sorry, this might be like, because I don't know anything about this topic, it might be completely random, but I was really interested to see the example that you showed of camouflage infrastructure. And I was wondering if you might think that in India, for example, there is some sort of maybe a post-colonial anxiety or a post-colonial pride at work, where technological advancement and modernity is seen as something that needs to be flaunted rather than camouflaged. For example, like the Dish TV example makes me think of, often you will cross like a JJ cluster or something, and you will see these sort of dishes, and it instantly becomes sort of a symbol that says that, all right, I might live in a space like this, but I still have access to technology. So if you have any thoughts on that.
That's a great point, Annika, and that's precisely what I found out, that that indeed there are times kind of flaunted as a technology of modernity, and which will ubiquitous computing and communication and so forth, at the same time as there are anxieties in among other kinds of communities. So I think cell towers in that sense, some mark them as eyesores or even polluters, and some others found that they were actually a rather sleek technology, certainly enabling and being foundational for sleek technologies like the mobile phone.
Because it sort of reminded me, sorry, because you mentioned Bhubaneswar, and she's obviously written about this in an environmental context. But it's really interesting to think of like sort of privileged perceptions of technological infrastructure, where, depending on where the tower comes up, it might be an eyesore or it might be something to celebrate. That was really interesting. Sorry, I just like thinking out loud.
Yeah, no, thanks. I mean, I think that's where the debate is, indeed, that they have a certain kind of ambivalence about them.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, Rahul, and thanks, Annika, and thanks for everybody with your questions in the Q&A. Just a reminder, please do put them in over there for our speakers. Just in the interest of time, what we'll do now is go on to Debasish Mishra, who's joining us from the National Institute of Science, Education and Research. Debasish, all yours.
Thank you, sir. Give me a moment till I set the slides.
Sure.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. The topic is Urban Imaginaries, Home and Unbelonging in the Jesus Trilogy of James Coetzee. It is a part of my PhD thesis, and I'm thankful to NISER and HBNI for the support. Simon and Peterson say that the city is always something to be remade according to new models, new possibilities of generating value. They shed light on the notion of redescription, which according to them goes beyond imagination, fantasy or forward visualization. Here, redescription entails the idea of doubleness, which is making things different and in seeing of what exists other than what we think we are seeing. In other words, it opens up alternative possibilities. In this regard, the Jesus Trilogy by James Coetzee offers the redescription of an anonymous city in the south with the proposition of an irreal premise. Here, irreal premise connotes two assumptions. First is there are two places, Novilla and Estrella, and at the same time, there is the assumption that these places are inhabited by refugees. Now, before I move ahead, I'll give a brief overview of the Jesus Trilogy. The Jesus Trilogy began with the Childhood of Jesus, which was published in the year 2013. It was followed by the School Days of Jesus, published 3 years later in 2016. And the final book of the trilogy, The Death of Jesus, was just published recently, that's last year. In the beginning, we are told that the new arrivals Simon and David are looking for a place to live, some work, and David's mother. They find work while Simon gets work as a stevedore in a dock, and then they meet Ines, who agrees to be the mother for David, and they become a family thereafter. However, taking into account the aversion of David to Punto Arenas, the school designed for special children, and David believes that it is full of barbed wire, and that is why he doesn't want to go to school, whereas schooling is compulsory in the city of Novilla, and that is why they have to flee from Novilla to Estrella. So after fleeing from Novilla to Estrella, they look for different employment opportunities, and in the end, David dies, Ines departs, and Simon is left alone. So that's the premise of the trilogy. There is some ambiguity with regard to the setting of the trilogy because there are no fixed determinants as such. However, there has been consensus among scholars that it corresponds to the South. Mark Ferrand, for example, believes that it corresponds to a 20th century South American setting, while Twiddle calls it a vaguely Mediterranean geography. I would like to say that the pair of cities are posed as a literary symbol which gives a utopian ideal of what should be the ideal kind of life, and it stands as a contrast to the world that stands outside its walls. In a sense, it becomes a contrast to the real world by being a utopian literary symbol. Now, it becomes important to know why Coetzee prioritizes the South, how he prioritizes it, and why he privileges it. First of all, the release of the Spanish version of The Death of Jesus, the final book of the trilogy, predates the English version. Moreover, in an interview, Coetzee himself says that the language spoken in Novilla and Estrella is that of an afterlife, and it is, within quotes, not English but Spanish. Rebecca Walkowicz talks of bond translation with regard to the Jesus trilogy. By bond translation, she means that the language which is inherently there in the text is Spanish, and Coetzee is involved in translation right from the word go. Now, if you see the seminar series Literatures of the South, it is directed by Coetzee twice a year since 2015. And here he invites writers and scholars from South Africa and Australia, and they talk about literatures of the South. When it comes to Coetzee's vision of a South, it is different to what scholars view as Global South. Global South, according to Coetzee, is a mythic construct. It is an abstraction coined out of absences. On the other hand, Coetzee proposes a real South of shared physical experiences and complex histories of colonization. Coetzee's vision of a culture of the South encompasses Latin America, Southern Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. So these are the places where he has been, and he wants to construct a South out of these places. In this case, the Jesus trilogy bisects the notions of a mythic South and the real South and proposes an emergent South. When we talk about Coetzee's life, he is old enough, he's in his 80s now, and as per his own admission, he is in the third stage of his career, where one dwells on the second order questions, such as what is the difference between living in the real world and living in a world of representations. The Jesus trilogy, in this regard, gives him the scope to explore this world of representations in an appropriate manner. Now, when we talk about the urban imaginaries in the trilogy, Coetzee believes in showing in place of saying. In this regard, he takes into account Kevin Lynch's idea of imageability. By imageability, Kevin Lynch talks about that particular quality of an object which evokes a stronger image in the observer. A highly imageable city, according to him, is one which is well-defined, structured, and distinct. So I will just point out some of the structural elements of the trilogy and say how Coetzee corresponds to Lynch's idea of imageability. For example, the Centre de Relocation Novilla, which is the relocation center, is described as a low sprawling building. Then Anna tells to Simon, go to building C, I'll draw you a map. This can be interpreted as Coetzee's instruction to the readers to follow his map so as to find the key of the trilogy. Subsequently, Simon finds employment at the docks where wharves stretch upriver as far as the eye can see. This particular image locates the reader in the place of Simon. The reader, in other words, inhabits the place of Simon and sees the wharf stretching till the end. So by this, Coetzee creates images and evokes the sense of sight. Similarly, he gives a description of Simon's home, then La Residencia, and the Institute of Further Studies by evoking the sense of sight. For example, La Residencia is discussed as a brick wall with a rusty gate overgrown with ivy. Similarly, the Institute of Further Studies, which is another physical structure of novella, is discussed as a tall white building with glass doors. Now, when the three characters, I mean Simon, David, and Ines, move from novella to Estrella, on the way they encounter this road sign. I have shown this road sign here just to clarify Coetzee's logic. He says Estrelita del Norte 475 kilometer, Nueva Esperanza 50 kilometer. So they are on their way and they see this road sign, which makes us believe that we are on a journey too. So this again invokes Lynch's idea of imageability. On a similar note, the Academy of Dance is described as a sign in florid gold letters. The art museum is again bordered by a long sandstone colonnade. The orphanage on the far side of the river, Las Manos, is described as a place where Coetzee seeks refuge. Now, after discussing the urban imaginaries, I would like to throw some light on the notions of home and unbelonging in the trilogy. The quest for a home is evident in all the three books of the trilogy. The word home has been repeated roughly 60 times in each of the novels. In the beginning of the trilogy, Simon and David are looking for a place to live, within quotes. Now, Simon asks Anna, who is the official there, are there organizations in novella that help to bring families together, families and friends? And Anna says, no, I've never heard of such an organization. So this particular response by Anna exonerates the state from matters of filial concern. However, by providing free accommodation, free employment, the state plays the role of a facilitator. Focusing on the negative side of the cities, Marie Louis Nott talks of a welfare state dictatorship that is at power in the cities. She says an invisible power is there in the cities which treats the citizens and subjects and strips them of their memories, their histories, and their passions. Hania A.M. Nassif also echoes the same sentiment when it talks of a faceless, controlling bureaucracy in novella. Now, when it comes to unbelonging, it has some bearing to the last slide, because apart from the negative side, which has been talked about by Hania M. Nassif and Mary Nott, there are textual elements which correspond to this sense of unbelonging. For example, there is a leisure and recreational center in novella, and when Simon wants to get access to a personal therapist there, he is denied access. Although he says that he's not a transient and he has settled in novella, however, he doesn't get access. So this kind of evokes some unbelonging in him. Furthermore, in a conversation with Diego, who happens to be the brother of Ines, Simon says, who am I doesn't matter. I'm not important. I'm a kind of manservant. So this particular statement relegates his identity and furthers the sense of unbelonging. In another confrontation, there is another character called Dimitri who calls Simon a stranger from nowhere. So these are the elements that show that unbelongingness is ingrained in the text. Similarly, David is deemed to be a special child, and he is advised to go to Punto Arenas, that is a special school for children with special needs. But according to David, there is barbed wire in Punto Arenas and he has nightmares of Punto Arenas. That is why he doesn't want to go there. So these are some of the elements of unbelonging which are evoked in the three novels. To counter this unbelonging, Coetzee proposes the idea of mutual dependence. This is a borrowing specifically from Butler's idea of precariousness, which Judith Butler describes as living socially. That is, the fact that one's life is always in some sense in the hands of the other. A dependency on people we know or barely know or know not at all. In the case of the trilogy, where everyone is a refugee, this dependency comes to the fore. Take the case of the three primary characters, Simon, Ines, and David. They have no filial concerns. They have no kinship which binds them. Yet Simon has obligations towards David. Ines has obligations towards David. Then there are other minor characters who help the three of them and they help each other. Simon, for example, says he has no social circle, and the reason is that he has devoted himself to the boy's upbringing. So this goes on to show the high degree of importance attributed to mutual dependence. As I stated before, the irreal premise of this whole place inhabited by refugees and other displaced persons, it helps Coetzee's premise of putting forth the idea of precariousness or mutual dependence. So when Butler in a recent interview called for the kinds of networks that receive people and which understand that everyone has a right to be received, everyone has a right to belong. In this case, this trilogy can be seen as a response to Butler's urge. Maybe Coetzee wants to postulate that this is a place where everyone is welcomed without any attention to their race or to their heritage. Now, I will now move on to the conclusion. Today, more people than ever live in a country other than the one in which they were born. In 2019, according to the UN, the number of migrants globally reached an estimated 272 million. So global migration is an unchangeable phenomenon now. In this case, Coetzee attempts to undo the binarism of self and others. The others, in this case, are the refugees who, according to Judith Butler, are oftentimes viewed as second-class citizens. Now, Coetzee is also an advocate against the detention camps of asylum seekers. In a review of Behrouz Boochani's work published in the New York Review of Books, which is titled Australia's Same. In that particular review, Coetzee detests the idea of detention. He is against the hostility shown to the refugees. So in this case, we can see the trilogy as a place where the refugees are welcomed with hospitality. The idea of nation is also fluid here because we are not given proper boundaries. We are not given a national anthem as such. There are no national languages, there are no national literatures, and the idea of nation is posited as a fluid construct. So maybe Coetzee is willing to critique the idea of nation and nationalism. Similarly, this is a place where accommodation is easily available. Employment is not difficult to find. That is why the concept of poverty is absent here. In an interview, Coetzee talks of himself as an international author in a different sense. He calls himself a writer who is not located in any particular language or any particular country. So this translocational position of Coetzee is reflected in the trilogy, where the places do not have any direct correspondence to any particular place in the globe. There is a place in the text where Simon says, here as opposed to where, there is nowhere else to be but here. This can be interpreted as Coetzee's instruction to the readers that one has to inhabit the urban imaginaries of the trilogy in order to understand what Coetzee wants to postulate. Coetzee, for example, is writing a history of the settlement of the valley, while his reader, like Simon, wonders, a history. I didn't know that places like Estrella even had a history. So in this case, the silver lining is that of mutual dependence, which in the words of Judith Butler is denoted by the term precariousness, which is predicated on the notion of corporeal vulnerability, where the characters seek a home in one another. So these are some of the references that I have taken into account. I want to thank NISA, HBNI, my supervisor, and the Faculty of English, Dr. Joe Verghese, and my other peers in NISA. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Debasish. That was really good. So what we'll do is open it up for questions now. And like I mentioned earlier, for folks who are watching this live, please do type in your questions in the Q&A box. I'll just, Debasish, I had a question. I'll
Yes,
just
sir.
get us started. And I'll apologize because this isn't really my area. And so I'm coming at it from a very layperson's perspective.
Yes,
But what was interesting for me was the idea of the Spanish and the English, and sort of
yes, sir.
thinking through the notions of belonging and unbelonging uh, in particular types of articulations in Coetzee's work. Uh, I was wondering if you could just throw some light in any kind of difference in that, or in any kind of similarity. Is there a shared way of articulating that
Yes, sir.
in those languages?
Yes, sir. Uh, we can locate the post-colonial notion here because Coetzee doesn't abide by the English of America and Britain, and English is particularly the language in which he writes. So writing in a language and at the same time critiquing it is inherent here because we are talking in English. The novel is written in English, but it is suggested that the conversations and everything else takes place in Spanish. So I would take it as a critique of the language in which it is spoken, and this form of this is more of a post-colonial a post-colonial strand which is reflected here. And Coetzee has often written on post-colonial literature. So this corresponds to that particular view.
Okay. One more, if you don't mind.
Yes, sir, please.
There was also a point that you made that there is no belonging without history or memory. And
Yes,
isn't there respite from that in any of Coetzee's work?
Sir, in this case, in the trilogy, the history and memory, they are all stripped apart from the characters. When they arrive in this new place, they arrive without any history as such, without any memory as such. So they try to fit in this new place. So they don't have memories as such, but what Coetzee calls the shadows of memories. So these are more of the remnants which are there, and they're not properly able to locate where their home is. So when we talk about unbelongingness, this unbelongingness becomes more acute because they do not know from where they come. So they're trying to fit in a new place, but they're also not aware from their place of origin, the place from which they've originated. So that is why I think the feeling of unbelonging becomes acute here. Due to the absence of history and memory.
But there isn't a way in which there is a hopeful articulation of that beyond it.
Yes, sir. The absence of memory and the absence of history are consolidated, and they are compensated with the idea of mutual dependence. And as I told you, this entire premise is of a place where everyone is a refugee. So Coetzee gives an ideal premise where they depend on one another, and this mutual dependence gives them the scope of undoing everything else. Maybe the hostility which is oftentimes shown towards the refugees, where boundaries are not usually fluid, where when one is not welcomed in another country other than his own. So Coetzee tries to do away with those boundaries.
All right. Thank you so much, Debasish. That
My
was,
pleasure, sir.
I don't think there are any more questions. So what we'll do now is go on to the next presentation. That's by Isha Tyagi, who's joining us from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. Isha, all yours.
Thank you so much. I'll just share screen. Is my screen visible?
Yes. Thank you.
And am I audible?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So thank you and good evening, everyone. My name is Isha Tyagi and I'm presenting a research proposal titled Space Making by Women in the Neoliberal City through the cinema of Alankrita Shrivastava. By neoliberal city, I mean a city where urban policy prioritizes market-centered growth and elite forms of consumption that give rise to a consumer society, and also a city where we see spatio-cultural transformations in space due to the rise of new kinds of places of consumption which cater to a certain kind of class that can, first of all, afford to be in those spaces. And here, I propose to analyze the cinema of Alankrita through her two films, Lipstick Under My Burqa and Dolly Kitty Aur Wo Chamakte Sitare. In both her films, Alankrita primarily follows the lives of women protagonists who come from cisgendered, heterosexual, and various caste, class, and religious locations, and they are led by their own desires as they move in opposition to the patriarchal boundaries that are imposed on them. But at the same time, Alankrita also inserts the neoliberal city into their lives. As we see in case of Lipstick Under My Burqa, there is a subplot of the old city of Bhopal, where the real estate builders have their hearts set on acquiring this age-old historic housing society where Hindu and Muslim families live together, and it's known as Hawai Manzil. And this sort of hints at the erosion of the secular history and the secular character of the city to the forces of neoliberalism, and it hints at a creative destruction of the economic geography, borrowing the terminology from Brenner and Theodore. And in Dolly Kitty Aur Wo Chamakte Sitare, the stories are set in the the city of Greater Noida, which, unlike Bhopal, doesn't have an old history, but has recently come into being to decongest the capital city of Delhi. And it is being posited as a world-class city and has its own promises. So it's good to explore them through her film. I propose to analyze the urban imaginations of space making by women through Alankrita's work by looking as women both as consumers and service providers. So this is an image from one of the beginning scenes of Lipstick Under My Burqa, where we see a woman strolling in a cosmetic store in a mall. And this image in particular, I would say, is the key frame of Alankrita's films, because her protagonist, whose story she primarily tells, that woman is right there in the center. But at the same time, she is standing at the very heart of a space of consumption. She's populated by these images of Emma Stone on one hand, who is selling some eyeliner. There is Revlon, there is Clarins. There is also an out of focus mannequin, which is wearing a corset. And at the same time, right, the most interesting part of this is the mirror in the center, which reflects this woman in an almost Lacanian sense, hinting at the insertion of this woman into the neoliberal beauty myth, into that ideological order. And that makes us question that what possibilities does neoliberalism open up a woman by interpolating them with these subjectivities. Now, when we talk about neoliberal cultures, we often come across this argument that the messaging sort of tends to homogenize people, and people sort of uncritically absorb these kinds of messages, and that leads to a sort of homogenization. But if we look at the reflection in the mirror, the woman is looking away, and she's not looking directly at herself in the mirror, which brings us to the question raised by Stephen Miles, who implores us to think that what the opportunity to consume itself means to the consumer in the neoliberal city. And he proposes that that we should not look at people as just passive consumers, but as active participants who actively engage with with neoliberal cultures and bring their own meanings to it. And he proposes that consumption offers a form of belonging and even citizenship that might otherwise be unavailable to people. And I propose that we should look at consumption as not just as consumption of materialistic objects, but also consumption of images and subjectivities and dreams for oneself, and seeking spaces where such dreams can be fulfilled. So I would like to take the example of the character played by Ratna Pathak in the film Lipstick Under My Burqa. So this is the character who goes by the name Buaji. She's the owner of Hawaii Manzil, and that I mentioned before. And she also runs a local sweet shop. And she's a widow. She's a middle-aged woman who's a widow, and she's respected a lot in her community. People look up to her, come up to her for advice. But beyond that, there is no identity of her, and she's inserted into that patriarchal system of that gender role of being a Buaji, and being that asexual self as from the lens of Brahminical patriarchy. But it so happens, through a serendipitous accident in the neoliberal city, she finds herself at one of the swimming clubs in the city, where the swimming instructor, he invites her to his swimming classes, and he's filling a form for her, and he asks her her name. So she says irritatingly that my name is Buaji, and he presses on that who, and Buaji means aunt in Hindi, aunt, or yeah. So she says that my name, she initially says that her name is Buaji, but when he presses on, she says that her name is Usha Parmar. And as she says that, we can see that she is visibly affected when she says that name, as if she's realizing that she has a different identity as opposed to Buaji. And she's also attracted to the swimming instructor in that moment, which leads her to participating in the pleasures of the city. She's scared, but she goes to a mall that she has never been to before to buy a swimming costume for herself. And later she also joins the swimming classes, which brings us to the idea of affirmative aesthetics of space making by women, which is proposed by Maud Sutrick, in which she asks us to question the various ways in which women occupy space on the cinematic screen. And she says that either they are shown as either being dispossessed by the oppressive power structures, or being empowered by them, or through some other twist of fate. Maud wants to point our attention towards how women endure oppressive power structures and simply try to claim space for themselves that was initially denied to them, and express a sort of willfulness in doing so. So this is one lens through which the protagonists of Alankrita Shrivastava can also be approached. And the second lens through which I want to look at the women in her films is by looking at them being a worker or a service provider in the neoliberal economy. So this is an image from the film Dolly Kitty or Wo Chamakte Sitare, where Kajal, played by Bhumi Pednekar, is a migrant to the city, and she has come to work at this office space, which is Red Rose Romance app, which is kind of a BPO sort of place which sells romantic conversations through phone, and is also a gift shop. And on first look, if we look at this image, this seems like a nice place. Women are happy, they are comfortable in working here, and they also have their perks. They have they have transportation facilities which drop them back home, and they also get free food here. So this is a very nice corporate sort of workspace. But the catch here is that when Kajal works here, she works as Kitty, not as Kajal. And as Kitty, while she is working, she has to put in an emotional labor in her work when she's talking to the people on phone. But her bosses, they do not see her as Kajal, they see her as Kitty, and they do not account for the emotional labor that she puts into her work. And it so happens in the film that she has an unhappy incident with one of the clients, after which she's upset, and she's forced to leave her job, which brings us to the ambivalence of neoliberalism in the kinds of subjectivities it sort of interpellates its citizens with. On one hand, as we saw in case of Buaji, a lot of possibilities are offered to her, which open up ways for her to explore her desires. But as we see in case of Kajal, these possibilities are quite limited, and when it comes to extracting labor from her, the neoliberal work economy goes by the notion of profit. And this scene also points towards the idea that there is a precariousness in the job economy. And as we see in case of Kajal, she doesn't have labor rights, so to say, or to argue for herself, and the neoliberal work culture does not see her as a full human. So these are the ambivalences of neoliberalism that we see in Alankrita's work. And in her work, we also see the changing sense of a place in neoliberal urbanization. So this is again an image from Dolly Kitty or Wo Chamakte Sitare. And this is a scene whose mood is this is a mood of, there is a mood of leisure and fun. And these people are zooming through the lone wide roads of Greater Noida. And this guy who is sitting in the driver's seat, he shouts that Greater Noida is the new Shanghai, sort of hinting at this euphoria of this new city, that it's going to be a world-class city. But the interesting thing to note in this particular image are the JCB excavators that are standing on the sides of the road, which according to me hint at a city which is still under construction, whose promises still haven't been delivered. But the attractions of the city are all over the place, as we see in this scene as well. This is from the beginning of Dolly Kitty, where we see the two sisters having fun in a sort of theme park, sort of amusement kind of space. And in the first image, we see in particular that Kajal, played by Konkana, she is very happy, and she's sort of thrilled and sort of immersed in the pleasures that this place is providing to her. And when Kajal expresses something deeply serious to her regarding her husband's behavior with her, uh, Konkana's character completely dismisses it. So the gravity of the situation is completely lost to her. So through these images, I was just trying to show the kinds of spaces that are coming up in the city of Greater Noida that Alankrita Shrivastava has tried to show. But at the end of the day, it's pertinent to notice whether the promises of the city are delivered or not, and at whom are these promises ultimately aimed at. Because as we see in the film and both in reality, the residential projects that were supposed to come up in the city of Greater Noida, they don't. And that leads to a rise of a sort of a ghost town kind of space where there is a sort of placelessness. And particularly whenever we see Kajal, played by Bhumi Pednekar, whenever we see her in the film out on the streets alone at night, she is always harassed, and she's never safe. So that also sort of hints at the kind of space segregation that is happening. And you can be safe and you can access those pleasures only if you can afford to be in those spaces. And this brings me to the question of how do we understand placelessness? Placelessness was a term coined by Edward Relf in his book in 1976. And what is the diversity of experiences of placelessness in the neoliberal city among people from various social locations? And how does our relationship with places change in the neoliberal city? So I would like to leave you with these questions. of urban imaginations of freedom when we look at Alankrita's work, and when we apply the methodology of Maud Sutrick that I discussed before, related to affirmative aesthetics of space making by women, that how does neoliberalism reorder space and people to create new physical and psychological geographies in the city, and in what ways do women create space for themselves in the city to realize their desires. And ultimately, from these discussions, the lines on which we should approach the urban imagination of a city, that imagination should be intersectional and an inclusive feminist city. So these are the questions that I have. And now I leave the floor open for questions and ideas as to how I could approach her films in a different manner. Thank you so much. And I'll stop sharing my screen now.
All right, thanks so much, Isha. Again, just a reminder to folks who are watching this live, please do put your questions in the Q&A section. So I'll open this up with I don't know, did any of the panelists have a question? Rahul? Yeah, please.
Isha, really liked your presentation and gave me a lot to think here, especially around affirmative aesthetics. And I really liked how you thought through those frames. I was interested, because there's been some writing on call center workers. I'm thinking of Purnima Mankekar's work on, and she discusses this idea of how subject formation, when subjects are sort of inserted in circuits of capital, neoliberal capital, and she uses kind of concepts like aspiration as well as impersonation, personation, like the way you talked about Buaji, Usha, Kadal Kitty. I'm curious, since then, aspiration sometimes is like too all-pervasive a term sometimes, and impersonation often is discussed like with any kind of like partially anonymous conversations, but also it's part of kind of the dynamic subjectivity formation. So I'm curious if these terms, aspiration and impersonation are also part of the ways in which you're thinking about this project of yours. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your question. I think it's really interesting. I mean, I had not thought of this before, and I think it's really interesting to employ these terminologies to look at Alankrita's work, because at the end of the day, all her protagonists are very aspirational, like the term that you used. But at the same time, so if I take the example of Kajal, played by Bhumi Pednekar, she decides to be in that job even though it demands a lot of emotional labor from her, because it is a big thing for her, because it is mentioned in one of the scenes in the film that she comes from a backward caste from the city of Darbhanga. So it's a big thing for her to come to this new city to participate in its pleasures, but at the same time she needs this job in order to pay her house rent, so that she otherwise she would be forced to go back home. So in that sense, so though it is a part of her aspirations, but it is also a need. And these two things, these are the kind of constraints that women go through when they participate in the city, and sometimes they are just forced to do things because they have to economically sustain themselves. And in Alankrita's work, we do see that all the characters, they face various kinds of economic constraints and various kinds of but at the same time they're also aspirational, and they exercise this will to imagine their aspiration even in another city. Like we saw in case of Kajal, that she didn't want to stay back in Darbhanga. She wanted to come to the greater city of Noida, and she exercised a lot of willfulness with respect to her parents and family in coming there. And we see that in case of Leela's character in Lipstick Under My Burqa as well, who just wanted to be entrepreneurial and go to another city. So yeah, I think, thank you for pointing it out. And I think these are very interesting ways of looking at how women look at aspirations, and how far are they ready to go to in order to achieve them, and how is the city creating these spaces and these constraints for them. So thank you.
Thanks, Isha.
Okay, while we wait for a few more questions, Isha, if you don't mind, I have one for you.
Yes.
Just again, coming from a very lay perspective on this, the idea of the depiction of the female character and against an other of some sort, a gendered other, particularly male, masculine, and in the male characters, and particularly Dolly, the film with Bhumi and Konkana Sen. There are, I mean, to my mind, at least three distinct male characters over there who are depicted in very particular ways, right? Um, the the young boy who comes in with the AC, or is it a
Yeah,
fridge? I'm forgetting. And
Usman. Yes.
Osman, and there's the brother-in-law, and there's
Pradeep, played by Vikrant Massey.
Vikrant Massey's character, right? So, I mean, if you could just reflect on those characterizations and the ways, like to my mind, it seems there are very particular ways of thinking about those characters as connected to our sometimes oldish understandings of neoliberal sort of imaginations of that, the the opportunistic, the cold, the this one, and Usman's character as being, as the new India, the shining India, the like those characters. So I don't know if you had a few thoughts on how those characters play out against the idea of the neoliberal city.
So, if I were to talk about the men in Alankrita Shrivastava's films, I think she puts in a lot of thought in that as well, because Alankrita always shows that there are no perfect men in all her films, and they let all their women down. If you look at Lipstick Under My Burqa or in Dolly Kitty Aur Wo Chamakte Sitare, because she's trying to show that what are the kind of constraints that women face in with respect to women, whether those men are their parents or those men are their boyfriends. I mean, she basically the storyline of all Alankrita's films is in a manner that at the end of the day, as the story ends and as the film ends, there are spectacular failures. As the term Jack Habestam has coined for her book, whose name I'm forgetting, but she says that when you are queer and you are sort of moving, and so when you are challenging these oppressive power structures of the society, you are bound to fail. And these failures are there in both her films. And when we look at the men, it is the men who always let these women down. So if we look at Pradeep's character, who cheats, who sort of ditches her when they get caught in a police station, and there is this husband of Konkana Sen who has his own problems, and it is important because such kind of characters are not generally discussed. We do not really get to see them in the mainstream. So it's interesting to see those characters, but Usman's character is the most interesting because Usman is like the perfect guy. But and in this we also see Alankrita's politics, that Alankrita in her film also hints at the rise of Hindutva nationalism. And there are other men in the film who are sort of DJs who come from who come from the Gurjar caste, and who have their own authority on the streets as they go, and they do go around bullying people and destroying spaces. So and it's really sad that she kills off one perfect guy, she kills off Usman's character at the end. So it's her politics, and it's very it is very strategical how she's how she's placing the male characters in her film as opposed to the women.
Okay. Sorry, I missed this, but I think Annika had a quick question. Annika, we are a little out of time, but if you can.
Yeah, I'm just gonna, sorry. That was super interesting. I really enjoyed watching both those movies, and it was really nice to see like a breakdown of them from an academic perspective. Since you sort of ended on like open-ended questions, one of the themes that for me really stuck out in Dolly and Kitty was the idea of transport. Transport,
Okay.
yeah, and mobility. That was sort of one of the things that I kept coming back to through the movie, because I found it really interesting that um, in a lot of ways it was about these women trying to find ways to get from space A to space B. Like for Kitty, one of the big perks of the job was that there was an AC car pickup and drop service and things like that. So I think, since one of the questions you had said, like what would make a really inclusive city, like for me, one of the points that movie kept driving home was, if you don't have a safe mode of transport, you're so vulnerable, right? Because like you said, every time Kitty is alone on the street, she is harassed. Like it happens no matter where she is. So I just sort of wanted to get your, like, is that something that you have like thought about, or do you have any like inputs on that, or just your perspective on mobility, if that's come across at any point?
So Yeah, thank you so much for your question, Annika. I think mobility is a very important aspect to look at whenever we are looking at urban imaginations of the city, and that is something that we see in Alankrita's films as well. Whenever Kajal is out on the street, she is
Yeah.
always harassed, and that sort of hints at what is the world class city that you're talking about in
Exactly.
your policy spaces. Whenever planners talk about a world class city, when you can't even guarantee that if a woman is out there at night on the street, she won't be harassed. So yes, this is one thing that I'm looking at, and uh, I'm not really sure how to answer this now because
No, of course. It was just like,
yeah, I mean this is also something that I'm looking at, and in Lipstick Under My Burqa, it is very interesting to see how they secretively try to just be out there in public space,
yeah,
because there is this sort of fear of shame and fear and shame from their own domestic households. So it is not just the outside that is unsafe for women. It is
yeah, it's also
also
the
their
inside.
own homes and the people in their own homes who also police how you are going to occupy space in public. And this is something that has been exposed by the book Why Loiter, by the
Yes,
book
yes.
by Shilpa Phadke,
Yeah.
Samira Khan, and Shilpa
Yeah.
Ranade, where they say that whenever we talk about safety and whenever we talk about public space, we always uh, focus a lot on the outside. And when we argue that the outside is safe, we create policies so as to throw women inside the house.
Yeah.
And recently there was this bizarre, I mean, I heard it in news, there was this bizarre proposal by the chief minister of Madhya Pradesh that now we're going to put trackers on
Track
women.
women. Yeah.
So it's really bizarre how instead of, and what Why Loiter argues for is the right to take risk, for
Yeah.
the right to be out there in public space instead of being cooped up in homes.
Yeah.
So yeah, so thank you for pointing that out. I think that's a very interesting way to look at Alankrita's work.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Annika. Thanks, Isha. Thanks so much. Thanks to Annika, Isha, Rahul, Manatula, and Debasish. Folks, parts of this will be eventually available on our YouTube channel, not all of them. So please look out for it. And that's the end of day 2 of Urban Arc. We will see you tomorrow. We start at 9:30 a.m. tomorrow morning. So hopefully most of you can make it over there. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Vikas, and thanks everyone for the interesting presentations.